The morning Clara turned 18, the world outside her window was gray and unwelcoming, just like every other day of her life. The cracked glass pane let in a draft that nipped at her thin arms as she laced up her worn boots. Her father's voice echoed from the other room, gruff and impatient, reminding her that the wagon would be arriving soon. There was no celebration, no breakfast, no tender farewell planned. It was the day she would leave home, and to her parents, that was cause for relief, not sorrow. Clara's mother sat by the hearth, hands folded tightly, eyes averted. The older woman had long since hardened into silence, a wall of bitterness Clara had never managed to climb. "Don't embarrass us," her mother muttered without looking up. "He's doing us a favor taking you." Clara nodded, though her throat burned with words she'd never dare to speak. A favor. That was what she was, a burden someone else had agreed to lift. For as long as she could remember, that idea had been hammered into her with every scolding, every glare, every long night she went to bed hungry while her father drank away their money at the tavern. "You're lucky anyone would want you," he had told her the night before. "Worthless girls don't get second chances." So Clara had learned to move quietly, to make herself small. She knew the floorboards that creaked and the chores that might earn her a rare nod instead of a slap. She had also learned that love was something that existed in stories told by travelers, not in homes like hers. As she gathered her small bundle of belongings, a single dress, a threadbare shawl, and her mother's old Bible, Clara's hands trembled. She told herself not to cry. Tears had never earned her anything but contempt. Still, her vision blurred as she looked around the only home she'd ever known. The peeling wallpaper, the smoke-stained rafters, the lonely little corner where she had once kept a rag doll until her father burned it, calling her too old for nonsense. Outside, the wagon waited. The driver, a man with dust in his beard and kind eyes, tipped his hat when she approached. "Headed west, miss?" he asked. Clara hesitated before nodding. "Yes, sir." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. She climbed onto the wagon's wooden seat, clutching her bundle to her chest like it held the last of her strength. As the wheels began to turn, she looked back only once. Her parents stood in the doorway, side by side, yet far apart, their faces expressionless. Her mother's arms were crossed. Her father had already turned away. The road stretched endlessly before her, miles of dust, hills, and sky. For the first time, the silence around her wasn't filled with shouting. It was strange, almost gentle. But even in that quiet, her thoughts were cruel. "You're worth nothing." The words followed her like ghosts, whispering in time with the creak of the wagon. She tried to imagine the man she was being sent to, Samuel, the rancher. She knew only what her father had said, that he was widowed, with land too big and hands too few. "He needs a girl who'll work hard and won't talk back," he'd said. "That suits you." The sky grew darker as the sun dipped low, painting the plains in fading gold. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter and wondered if Samuel would be kind, or if he would look at her with the same disappointed eyes she'd seen all her life. She didn't dare hope. Hope had always been dangerous, yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars of rejection and fear, a faint ember still glowed. Maybe it was the way the air smelled cleaner out here, or the way the horizon seemed endless. For the first time, Clara thought, perhaps I can start again. Then she shook her head. "Don't be foolish," she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. "You're worth nothing." And the wagon kept rolling west. The wagon creaked and swayed as it rolled farther from everything Clara had ever known. Dust trailed behind like the memory of her old life refusing to let go. She sat silently beside the driver, a broad-shouldered man named Mr. Tully, who hummed now and then to fill the long stretches of quiet. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the earth, steady, dependable, unlike anything in Clara's past. They had been traveling for 2 days. Each mile westward carried her deeper into unfamiliar country, wide fields that gave way to rolling hills, then endless plains dotted with lonely cottonwoods. It was beautiful in a way that frightened her, vast and merciless, as though the sky itself could swallow her whole. Mr. Tully tried to make conversation. "You'll like the McAllister Ranch," he said one afternoon as the sun burned red over the horizon. "Good land. Good man, too, from what folks say. Lost his wife a few years back. Hard worker, but fair?" Clara nodded, eyes fixed on her hands. She didn't know how to answer, didn't know what to believe. Fairness was not something she had often seen in her life. When people called someone good, it usually meant he was less cruel than most. Still, she listened to every word, trying to piece together an image of this Samuel McAllister, the man she was being sent to. In her mind, he was tall, sun-browned, with the same weary silence her father carried, but perhaps softer around the edges. Maybe he wouldn't yell. Maybe he wouldn't drink. Maybe if she worked hard enough, he would have no reason to send her away. They stopped that night near a stream to rest the horses. Clara helped gather firewood while Mr. Tully set up a small fire. The flames flickered across her face as she sat with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the sparks twist into the dark. The smell of wood smoke reminded her of home, but not in a comforting way. It reminded her of shouting, of slammed doors, of her father's boots stomping across the floor. "First time heading west?" Mr. Tully asked gently. "Yes," she said, voice soft as a breath. He nodded. "It's a hard land, but honest. You work it, it gives back. Can't say that about many places." Clara wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that somewhere out here, away from her parents' scorn, she could find something worth holding on to, a reason to lift her head. But then doubt crept in again, sharp and cold. People don't change. Not for girls like me. As she lay down under the stars that night, she thought of her mother's last words. "He's doing us a favor taking you." They rang in her ears like a curse. Even now, when the world was wide open before her, she felt small, like a debt to be paid. The next morning, they crossed a river, the horses struggling against the current. Clara held on tight, her heart pounding. When they finally reached the far bank, Mr. Tully grinned. "See? You're tougher than you look." She tried to smile, but it faltered. She wasn't used to praise. It didn't sit comfortably in her chest. Still, for a fleeting moment, she felt something stir inside her. Not pride, exactly, but the faint realization that she had survived another day. By the third evening, they saw the outline of the ranch in the distance, rolling pastures fenced in wood, a weathered barn, and a big white house standing alone against the open sky. Smoke curled from the chimney. Mr. Tully slowed the horses. "That's your new home, miss," he said. Clara stared ahead, heart thudding. Her new home. The words didn't feel real. She clutched the frayed edge of her shawl, unsure if she was ready to meet the man waiting there, or the life that would begin the moment she stepped down from the wagon. As the ranch drew closer, she whispered under her breath, half prayer, half plea, "Please! Just let him be kind." The wagon wheels rolled on, carrying her toward a future she could neither imagine nor escape. The morning Clara was still a day's ride away. Samuel McAllister stood on the porch of his ranch house, coffee steaming in one calloused hand. The air was sharp with early frost, and a low fog hugged the pastures, wrapping the land in quiet gray. He looked out over his fields, the fences that needed mending, the barn roof that leaked, and the cattle scattered across the ridge, and felt that same weary ache that had lived in him for 3 long years. His wife, Margaret, had been gone almost as long as the silence that followed her death. Pneumonia had taken her fast, one bitter winter, leaving him with 2 young children and a home that felt half empty no matter how hard he worked. In the beginning, Samuel had thought that time might dull the ache, but grief had a way of seeping into everything. The walls, the soil, even his breath. He wasn't a cruel man, but grief had hardened him. It made him quiet, deliberate, less given to laughter. The ranch hands respected him, though they often said he spoke more to his horses than to people. He didn't deny it. Horses, at least, didn't expect comfort. That morning, his foreman, Eli, rode up from the lower pasture, tipping his hat. "Heard the girl's on her way," Eli said. "Wagon left Red Rock 2 days ago." Samuel nodded, eyes still on the horizon. "Good. Kids could use someone steady around the house. I can't keep leaving them with neighbors." Eli grinned faintly. You sure she's not here to be more than a housekeeper? Samuel gave him a sharp look but said nothing. The arrangement had been made through a church contact, a mutual understanding that Clara, an orphaned or unwanted young woman, needed a place to go, and he needed help. Nothing more. Or so he told himself. Truthfully, Samuel wasn't sure what to expect. The letter had described her as quiet, capable, and of good temperament. He didn't need beauty or charm. He needed someone who could keep the home from falling into ruin and the children from feeling forgotten. After Eli rode off, Samuel walked into the barn, where his daughter Annie, 6 years old, was trying to brush one of the ponies with a brush twice her size. Her little brother Luke, only 4, was stacking feed sacks like toy blocks. Careful, son, Samuel said, catching the sack before it toppled onto the boy. Luke giggled, and Samuel managed a small smile, one of the rare ones he allowed himself. Pa, Annie asked, is the new lady coming today? Tomorrow, maybe, he said, setting her brush aside. She's coming to help us. You be polite, you hear? Will she be like Mama? She asked. The question pierced him like a thorn. No, sweetheart, he said softly. No one's like Mama, but she'll be kind, I think. He hoped that was true. That night, Samuel sat alone by the fire after the children had gone to bed. The flames danced across the worn furniture, the empty chair that used to belong to Margaret. He ran a thumb over his wedding band, still on his finger, still cold against his skin. He wasn't looking for love. He didn't believe love could find him again after so much had been buried. What he wanted, what he needed, was peace. Someone to fill the quiet spaces, to help shoulder the work, to bring steadiness, where grief had left only emptiness. But as the firelight flickered across the floorboards, a whisper of doubt moved through him. Was it right to bring another lost soul into this lonely place? Would she see the emptiness for what it was and run? He sighed and looked toward the window, where the stars glimmered faintly above the open plains. Somewhere out there, the wagon was carrying a girl toward his home, a stranger who might just change everything. And though Samuel didn't yet know her name, something in him, a small, stubborn spark of hope he thought had long since died, stirred awake. Tomorrow, his life would no longer be just his own. The wagon turned up the long dirt road leading to the McAllister Ranch, just as the sun began to dip behind the hills. The light stretched golden across the land, bathing the fences, the barn, and the wide house in a glow that made the moment feel unreal. Like a dream Clara was too afraid to believe. Her hands gripped her bundle tightly as the driver, Mr. Tully, called out. There she is! Miss, your new home. Home. The word struck her as both comforting and cruel. Samuel McAllister stood on the porch when they arrived. Tall and broad-shouldered, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, hands still dusty from the fields. He didn't move at first. He simply watched as the wagon approached, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Clara could feel his gaze long before the horses stopped. It wasn't harsh or unkind, just steady, quiet, like he was trying to take the measure of her without saying a word. Mr. Tully hopped down first. Evening, Mr. McAllister, he greeted. Got your new helper here safe and sound. Samuel nodded. Much obliged, Tully. Then his eyes shifted to Clara. Miss Clara, is it? She swallowed hard and stepped down from the wagon. The ground felt uneven beneath her feet, her legs weak from the long journey. Yes, sir, she said softly, unable to meet his eyes. Long ride from Red Rock, Samuel said, his voice low and rough, the kind of voice that came from years of shouting over wind and cattle. You must be tired. Clara nodded again, clutching her bundle tighter. She didn't know what to do with her hands, her feet, or the silence stretching between them. He wasn't what she expected, neither cruel nor dismissive, but his quietness unsettled her. People were never quiet unless they were thinking something unkind. Annie! Luke! Samuel called over his shoulder. Come meet Miss Clara. From behind the doorway peeked 2 small faces, a girl with honey-colored braids and a boy clutching a wooden horse. They hesitated, then stepped forward. The girl's eyes were wide with curiosity. "Hello?" Clara said softly, kneeling a little. "You must be Annie and Luke." Annie nodded. "Are you going to stay here now?" she asked bluntly. "If Mr. McAllister will have me," Clara answered, trying to smile. Samuel cleared his throat. "We'll see that you're settled." He gestured toward the house. "Your room's upstairs." "It ain't much, but it's warm." Clara followed him inside, her steps tentative. The house smelled of wood smoke and pine soap, with traces of something faintly sweet. Apple preserves, maybe. Everything was tidy but worn, chairs with smooth, faded arms, a quilt patched with care. It felt like a place where people had lived and loved once, and that made her chest ache. "This was Margaret's doing," Samuel said quietly, noticing her gaze. "My late wife. She had a way of making a house feel alive." Clara lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss, sir." He gave a short nod. "Thank you." In her small room, she set her bundle on the bed, a simple cot with a handmade blanket folded neatly at the end. Through the window, she could see the fields stretching endlessly, the sky turning lavender with dusk. For the first time in years, she felt safe enough to breathe deeply. Downstairs, the children whispered to each other, and Samuel's boots thudded softly across the floorboards. Clara heard him tell Annie, "She's had a long trip. Let her rest." His tone wasn't impatient, only considerate. Still, as Clara sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion tugging at her, a familiar unease crept back in. "Be useful," she told herself. "Don't give him reason to regret taking you." Outside her window, the crickets began their nightly song, steady and low. Clara lay down, staring at the ceiling beams, wondering what tomorrow would bring, and whether she'd be strong enough to face it. And downstairs, Samuel stood alone by the fire, gazing toward the stairs where the girl had gone. He didn't know why, but for the first time in years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Clara rose before dawn, lighting the stove while the sky was still gray, her breath visible in the chill air. She moved through her chores silently, milking the cow, sweeping the porch, mending torn shirts, always careful not to make mistakes, not to draw attention, not to be in the way. Years of scolding had trained her into invisibility. Samuel watched from a distance at first. He noticed how she flinched when spoken to suddenly, how she always waited for permission before touching anything, even the smallest thing like setting a cup on the table. He spoke kindly, but she answered in short, trembling sentences, eyes cast down. The children liked her immediately. Annie followed Clara around like a shadow, chattering as Clara hung laundry or kneaded bread. Luke, shy at first, began offering her his wooden horse as a kind of peace offering. When Clara smiled, small, hesitant, Samuel saw a glimpse of the woman she might have been if life had been gentler. But those smiles were rare, fleeting as the wind that swept across the prairie. One afternoon, Samuel came in from the fields to find Clara in the kitchen, struggling to lift a heavy pot of water onto the stove. "Careful there," he said quickly, stepping forward. She startled so sharply that the pot slipped, splashing boiling water onto the floor. I'm sorry, sir," she gasped, dropping to her knees to clean it, her hands shaking. "It's all right," he said, kneeling beside her. "You didn't burn yourself?" She shook her head, eyes wide, voice trembling. "I didn't mean to. I should have been more careful. I always ruin things." "Clara," he said gently, placing a hand on her wrist. "It's just water." "Happens to anyone." She froze at his touch, staring at the floor. Then she nodded quickly and whispered, "Yes." "Sir!" though the apology was still written all over her face. Samuel said nothing more, but later that evening, as he sat by the fire, he couldn't shake the image of her trembling hands. Whoever had raised her had carved fear deep into her bones. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Samuel rose to check the windows before turning in. Passing the kitchen, he paused. He heard a faint sound like someone whispering. He stepped closer, careful not to creak the floorboards. Clara was there, kneeling by the hearth, scrubbing the same spot on the floor she'd already cleaned twice that day. Her hair had come loose, falling over her face. "I'm worth nothing," she murmured under her breath, her voice raw and low. Nothing at all. Not good, not wanted. They were right. Samuel's chest tightened. He hadn't meant to overhear, but he couldn't look away. The girl in front of him wasn't lazy or stubborn. She was haunted. Haunted by words that had been spoken to her so often she'd come to believe them as truth. He stepped back into the shadows, his jaw set. He didn't want to embarrass her or make her retreat further into herself. Instead, he returned quietly to his room, his thoughts heavy. That night, he lay awake long after the lamp went out. The prairie wind whistled against the window, carrying the faint creak of the barn and the distant lowing of cattle. But over all that, he still heard her voice, small, broken, certain, "I'm worth nothing." He knew what it was to carry loss, but he had never known what it was to carry that kind of emptiness, to be told your life had no meaning. He couldn't sleep knowing she believed that about herself. The next morning, when Clara came down to prepare breakfast, she found a pair of leather work gloves neatly folded by the stove, too big for her but new and sturdy. Beside them lay a note in Samuel's rough handwriting. "No one who works this hard is worth nothing." She stood there for a long time, holding the gloves, tears welling up in her eyes. She didn't know what to do with kindness. It scared her more than cruelty ever had. But somewhere deep inside, something fragile began to stir. The days grew warmer as spring spread across the plains. And with the change in season came a slow, invisible shift within the McAllister ranch. The grass turned green again, the cattle fattened, and for the first time in years, laughter, soft, uncertain laughter, began to echo faintly through the house. It started with the children, but before long Samuel noticed it in Clara too. It began after she found the gloves. She never asked why he'd left them or what the note meant, but she started wearing them every day, their oversized fingers making her look almost childlike. When Samuel saw her that morning, bent over the garden, dirt smudged on her cheek, sleeves rolled to her elbows, he realized she'd begun to carry herself a little differently. Her shoulders weren't quite as bowed. He didn't press her, didn't speak of the words he'd overheard that night. Instead, he found small ways to remind her she belonged here. When she baked bread, he praised it softly. When she mended his torn shirts, he thanked her like it truly mattered. Each time, Clara's face colored with confusion, as if she couldn't quite accept that gratitude was meant for her. One afternoon, as the children played by the barn, Samuel asked her to help him repair a broken fence post. She hesitated at first, unsure if she'd be useful, but he only smiled. "I could use another pair of hands," he said. Clara followed him out to the field. The air smelled of sun-warmed grass, and the wind tugged at the ends of her hair. Samuel worked steadily beside her, showing her how to hold the post steady while he drove the nails. When her arms trembled from the weight, he reached over, steadying her grip with his own calloused hands. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly. She looked up, startled, but his expression held no teasing, no judgment, just calm certainty. For a moment she couldn't breathe. No one had ever said something like that to her before. Later, at supper, the children talked eagerly about the fence repairs, and Clara found herself laughing when Luke proudly declared that Miss Clara works better than Pa. Samuel grinned at that, and Clara felt heat rush to her face. But the warmth of that small, ordinary moment stayed with her long after the dishes were washed and the lamps dimmed. The ranch began to change in ways even Samuel didn't expect. The house looked cleaner, the meals heartier, the air lighter somehow. Annie started bringing Clara wildflowers from the field, and Luke insisted she read him stories before bed. Samuel, watching from the doorway, saw how naturally she fit into their lives, how her gentleness soothed the edges of their grief, how her quiet strength filled the spaces Margaret's death had left behind. But Clara didn't see it that way. She still worked as if one mistake might send her packing. Every compliment left her flustered. Every kindness seemed to wound her as much as it healed. When Samuel handed her a new bonnet from town, "Figured you could use one that fits," he'd said. She looked at him like he'd given her gold. "I can't repay you for this," she whispered. "Didn't ask you to," he replied, simply. For a long moment, she stood frozen, bonnet clutched in her hands. Then, quietly, she said, "You're the first person who's ever given me something I didn't have to earn." Samuel didn't know how to answer that. He just nodded, the words settling deep inside him. That night, as the prairie wind brushed against the windows and the smell of fresh bread lingered in the air, Clara sat by the fire sewing. The flames flickered across her face, softening her features. Samuel watched her from his chair, pretending to read. For the first time, he noticed how peaceful the house felt, how alive it seemed again. And though neither spoke it aloud, both of them, lonely souls carrying old wounds, felt something unspoken taking root between them, something that looked a lot like hope. The storm came suddenly, rolling across the plains like a living thing. One moment, the sky was a pale, endless blue. The next, it had darkened to the color of iron. The wind began to howl through the grass, bending the trees until they groaned, and a low rumble of thunder echoed from the hills. Samuel was out near the barn, trying to secure the horses before the rain hit. He looked up toward the house and frowned. The door was open, the curtains whipping in the wind, but Clara wasn't there. Inside, Annie and Luke were huddled near the hearth, eyes wide. "Where's Miss Clara?" Samuel asked quickly. "She went to get the calf," Annie said. "The little one that got out of the pen. She said she'd be right back." Samuel swore under his breath and ran for his coat. The storm had already begun to spit rain, cold and sharp against his face. He didn't think. He just went. Into the wind, into the wild. Clara, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle. The calf had slipped through a broken section of fence earlier that morning, and she'd seen it wandering near the edge of the pasture when the sky started to darken. Without stopping to think, she'd grabbed a rope and gone after it. It was foolish, she knew that now, but the thought of losing even one animal, of failing Samuel in any way, had driven her into the storm. Rain came down in sheets, stinging her face, soaking her dress until it clung to her legs. She could barely see through the blur of wind and water. The calf bleated somewhere ahead, frightened. Clara stumbled through the mud, calling out softly, "Easy now! Come on, little one!" Lightning split the sky, so bright it turned the world white for a heartbeat. Thunder followed instantly, deafening. The calf bolted. Clara lunged after it, tripped on a root, and went down hard. Pain shot up her knee. For a moment, she just knelt there, gasping, rain pounding on her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she didn't even know to whom. Samuel, perhaps, or the ghosts of her past. "I'm sorry. I always ruin things." Then, over the roar of the storm, she heard her name. "Clara!" She looked up, blinking through the downpour. Samuel was coming toward her, a dark figure against the gray, his coat whipping in the wind. "Clara!" he shouted again. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" She tried to answer, but her voice broke. He reached her in seconds, catching her by the arm and hauling her to her feet. She swayed, shivering violently. "The calf," she stammered. "It ran off. I didn't want to." "Forget the calf," he said sharply, though his tone was more fear than anger. "You'll freeze to death out here." He threw his coat around her shoulders and half carried her back through the mud, shielding her from the worst of the wind. When they finally stumbled into the barn, he kicked the door shut behind them. The horses stamped nervously, but the walls kept out the storm's fury. Clara stood trembling, hair plastered to her face, breath coming in gasps. Samuel grabbed a blanket from the tack room and wrapped it around her. "You could have been struck by lightning," he said, his voice low now, hoarse. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I didn't want to fail you," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I'm always—" He stopped her there, his hand coming up to tilt her chin toward him. His eyes, fierce and kind all at once, locked with hers. "Don't say that," he said firmly. "You're not worthless, Clara, you hear me?" "You're not nothing." The words hit her harder than the storm. She shook her head, unable to believe him, but the sincerity in his gaze held her still. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, completely, painfully seen. For a long moment, the world was silent except for the rain drumming on the roof. Then Samuel spoke again, softer this time. "You matter. To these children. To this home. To me," her breath caught. She wanted to answer, but the words tangled in her throat. All she could do was nod, her tears mingling with the rain still dripping from her hair. Outside, the thunder began to fade, leaving only the steady rhythm of the rain, gentle now, cleansing. And inside that old wooden barn, something shifted between them, something fragile but real, a spark of warmth in the coldest part of both their hearts. After the storm, something inside Clara changed. She couldn't name it exactly, only that she woke the next morning feeling different, lighter somehow. The rain had stopped, leaving the earth damp and fragrant, the air washed clean. From her window, she watched the sunrise spread across the fields in soft gold, touching every blade of grass with light. For the first time since she could remember, she didn't feel like a shadow in someone else's story. Samuel had found her clothes drying by the fire that morning, neatly folded. She'd woken on the couch, a blanket tucked over her shoulders, with Annie asleep on the floor beside her and Luke curled up in a chair. Samuel must have carried her in from the barn after she'd fainted from exhaustion. When he came in from the field, she tried to thank him, but he only said, "You'd have done the same for anyone," and went about fixing the door hinge that had come loose in the storm. Still, his voice held a quiet warmth that lingered long after he left the room. In the days that followed, Clara threw herself into her work, not out of fear anymore, but out of something new, something close to pride. She cooked heartier meals, taught the children songs she half remembered from her childhood, and began tending a small patch of garden by the porch. She planted herbs and wildflowers, telling Annie that even hard ground could bloom if given care. Samuel watched her transformation with quiet wonder. She smiled more now, tentatively at first, then more freely. Sometimes, when she laughed with the children, he would stop what he was doing just to listen. The house, once silent and heavy, now hummed with life. He realized he was beginning to look forward to her voice, her presence, her soft humming while she worked. One evening, as the family sat around the supper table, Luke dropped his cup, spilling milk across the tablecloth. Clara jumped up instinctively, ready to apologize, though she hadn't done anything wrong. But Samuel just chuckled and said, "It's only milk, son. No harm done." When Clara met his eyes, he gave her a knowing look, gentle, patient. She sat back down slowly, her heart thudding. It struck her then how different this home was from the one she'd left behind. No shouting, no slaps, no cruel words. Just the soft clatter of dishes, children's laughter, and the steady voice of a man who believed in calm more than anger. Later that night, as the children slept, Clara stood at the window, watching the moon rise. Samuel was outside, finishing his work by lantern light. Something inside her ached, a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Why did his kindness make her want to cry? When he finally came inside, wiping his hands on a rag, she spoke before she could lose her nerve. "You should have let me do that work," she said. "You do too much," he smiled faintly. "And you do more than you ought to. Seems we're both guilty." She hesitated, then asked softly, "Why are you kind to me, Mr. McAllister? I'm no one. I was sent here because no one else wanted me." He looked at her for a long moment, the lantern light flickering between them. "Maybe that's what folks told you," he said, his tone steady. "But I see someone who's kept going when most would have given up. Someone who works hard and doesn't quit, no matter how rough it gets." Her throat tightened. "You make it sound like that means something." "It does," he said simply. "It means everything." Clara turned away, her eyes stinging. She didn't know how to live in a world where words like that could be true. But she wanted to learn. For the first time, she wanted to believe she could be more than what she'd been told. Over the next weeks, her steps grew steadier. The children followed her through the fields, her laughter mingling with theirs. Samuel found excuses to linger near her, fixing the fence where she gardened, helping her carry water from the well. Neither spoke of the storm, but both knew something had begun that night, something they didn't dare name yet. And though Clara still doubted herself sometimes, she no longer whispered that old cruel phrase. The echo of "I'm worth nothing" grew fainter with each sunrise, replaced by something fragile but real, the belief that maybe, just maybe, she was worth love after all. By late summer, the ranch had come alive again. The grass stood tall and golden, the barn smelled of hay and sun, and laughter often drifted from the porch at dusk. Clara moved through her days with a quiet contentment she had never known before. She woke before dawn to bake bread and hum lullabies as she swept the floor. She had even begun to sing again, softly as she worked, and sometimes Samuel would pause in the doorway, just listening, pretending not to, but peace, as she would learn was fragile. One afternoon, while Samuel and the children were in town, Clara was hanging laundry behind the house when she saw a rider approaching. The horse was dusty, its rider unfamiliar, a postman. He tipped his hat, handed her a folded envelope, and said, "For Miss Clara Bennett." Her heart gave a sharp twist at the sound of her old name. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, her mother's. She stood there for a long moment, the envelope trembling in her hands. The last time she'd heard from her family was the day they'd sent her away, when her father had refused to look her in the eye and her mother had wept, saying, "It's for the best." Clara had been sold like livestock to a man she didn't know, all because she had been deemed barren and useless. Finally, with fingers gone cold, she tore the letter open. "Clara, we hear you're living with a rancher out west. You always did have a knack for finding others to take care of you. Times are hard here. Your father says if you have a roof and food, you should send something back. Money, or whatever you can spare. It's the least you owe us for raising you. We'll expect a reply soon." Mother, there was no kindness in the words. No love, only expectation. Clara's breath hitched. The old shame, the belief that she owed the world for simply existing, crept back into her bones. Her vision blurred as tears welled up. When Samuel returned that evening, he found her sitting by the stove, the letter clutched in her lap, untouched supper cooling beside her. "Clara?" he said softly. "You all right?" She blinked and forced a smile, but it crumbled fast. "It's nothing," she whispered. "Just family." He didn't press her at first, only knelt beside her and gently took the paper from her hand. As he read, his jaw tightened. When he looked up, there was a rare anger in his eyes. Not toward her, but toward the cruelty that letter carried. "You don't owe them a thing," he said firmly. "Yes, I do," she said quickly. "They fed me, raised me. I can't just ignore them." He shook his head. "They didn't raise you, they used you. And now that you've found a bit of peace, they're trying to take it." Clara's lips trembled. "But they're still my parents." Samuel's voice softened. "Blood doesn't always mean family, Clara. Sometimes family is who stays when everyone else throws you away." She stared at him, her eyes wide and wet. No one had ever spoken up for her before. No one had ever stood between her and the ghosts of her past. He rose and went to the cupboard, pulling out a small tin. "Here," he said, placing a few coins in her hand. "If you want to send it, you can. But do it because you choose to, not because they made you feel small." Clara looked down at the coins, then back at him. Slowly, she set them on the table. "No," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I've given enough." For the first time, she felt something break free inside her, like a chain she hadn't realized she was still dragging. She folded the letter, placed it by the fire, and watched as the flames took it, curling the paper into ash. Samuel stood beside her, silent. When she turned toward him, his expression was soft, half pride, half tenderness. "You did right," he murmured. "I'm learning," she whispered. "I'm learning I don't have to beg to be worth something." He smiled then, the kind that reached his eyes. "You never did." That night, Clara lay awake listening to the crickets and the soft breathing of the children in the next room. The wind brushed gently against the walls, but for once she wasn't afraid of it. The world outside might still be harsh and demanding, but inside this small ranch house, she had found something no one could take from her. The quiet. Growing certainty that she belonged, autumn settled gently over the ranch. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and apples. The sky deepened into a softer blue, and the fields shimmered with gold under the low afternoon sun. It had been weeks since Clara burned the letter from her mother, and since that day, Something within her had truly begun to heal. The shadows that used to cling to her were still there, but thinner, quieter. Every morning, she worked beside Samuel in the fields, helping to gather the last of the harvest before winter. They spoke more easily now, the silences between them no longer heavy with uncertainty, but filled with quiet understanding. The children adored her. Annie braided her hair every morning, and Luke followed her everywhere, calling her Ma by mistake more than once. Each time she'd smile, half startled, half moved to tears. But as peace settled in, another feeling began to stir, one she didn't know how to name. It was gentler than fear, deeper than gratitude. It made her chest ache whenever Samuel smiled or brushed past her in the narrow hallway. It was love, but she couldn't bring herself to believe she had the right to it. One evening, a cold wind swept across the plains, and Samuel decided to mend the roof before the frost set in. Clara, worried, climbed the ladder to hand him tools. The sunset painted the horizon in orange fire, and for a moment they stood together on the roof, the world stretching endlessly around them. "You don't have to do that," Samuel said, watching her carefully balance a hammer on the shingles. She smiled faintly. "You keep saying that, and I keep doing it anyway." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Stubborn woman. When she looked at him, her heart caught. The light made his face softer, the creases around his eyes deep but kind. He looked tired, yet steady. The way a man looks when he's built his life out of loss and still stands tall. "Samuel," she said suddenly, her voice almost trembling, "why did you take me in that day? You didn't know me. You could have sent me away." He stopped working, setting the hammer aside. "Because you needed a place," he said simply. "And because I saw something in your eyes I recognized." "What's that?" she asked. "Someone who's been hurt," he said quietly, "but hasn't given up yet." Her throat tightened. "I thought I had given up," she whispered. He turned to her then, really looking at her. "No," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "If you had, you wouldn't have walked through that door. You wouldn't have cared for those kids like they were your own. You wouldn't have faced down a storm to save a calf. You've got more strength in you than most people ever find." Tears welled up in her eyes. "You make me sound like someone worth something," she said, half laughing, half crying. Samuel reached out and touched her hand, just lightly, but the warmth of it ran straight through her. "You are," he said softly. "You always were." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind brushed past, carrying the faint sound of the children laughing inside the house. Then, without meaning to, Clara whispered, "I'm afraid." "Of what?" he asked. "Of being loved," she said. "Of losing it." He took her hand fully now, steady and sure. "Love isn't something you earn, Clara. It's something you're given, and I'm giving you mine if you'll have it." Her breath caught. She'd imagined those words 1,000 times, but never believed she'd hear them. Tears slid down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. He pulled her gently into his arms. She leaned into him, feeling the beat of his heart against her cheek, strong and sure. For the first time, the world didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something she could belong to. When they climbed down from the roof, the stars were beginning to appear, faint at first, then brighter. The children ran out to meet them, their laughter ringing in the crisp night air. Samuel's arm brushed against hers, and she smiled, shy but sure. Later, when the fire crackled low and the house grew quiet, Clara stood by the window, watching the stars. The words she'd once whispered, "I'm worth nothing," felt distant now, like an echo from another life. She turned as Samuel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You know," he murmured, "you've made this place home again." She looked up at him, her heart full. "No," she said softly. "You showed me what home could be." Outside, the wind carried the scent of the earth and rain, the same wind that had once frightened her. But now it only whispered promise. She wasn't broken anymore. She wasn't forgotten. She was loved, and she was enough.